Helping people understand history and how it keeps repeating in itself. The brainwashing of people, we're here to unhypnotize. Open your eyes and mind. See how you can be the change. Topics included chaos of Plato, or allegory of the cave. Montauk Project, Mandela effect. The problem with using labels and other topics that are considered conspiracy
Hello everyone, and welcome to Back to Light. Tonight, we're stepping into a concept that doesn't rely on force, but influence. Not chaos from the outside, but a transformation from within. We're exploring ideological subversion, a long-game strategy that reshapes how a society sees itself, what it believes, and ultimately, what it becomes. And this doesn't happen overnight, but slowly over the years, even generations. We'll walk through the 4 stages described by Yuri Bezmenov, and we'll examine how these shifts don't just happen around us, but through us. Because the real question isn't just whether this process exists, it's whether we can recognize it while we're living inside it. And now I present Article 8. The concept of ideological subversion, as articulated by Yuri Bezmenov, outlines a methodical process by which a society can be destabilized from within, not through overt warfare, but through sustained psychological and cultural influence. Rather than bombs or bullets, this strategy operates through ideas, narratives, and the gradual erosion of societal confidence in its own foundations. Bezmenov described this process in 4 stages: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization, each building upon the last, until transformation becomes not only possible, but welcomed. The first stage, demoralization, unfolds over decades. It is not a sudden assault, but a slow conditioning of the collective mind. Educational systems, media institutions, and cultural platforms become the primary vehicle through which values are reframed. Traditional moral foundations are increasingly portrayed as outdated or oppressive, while relativism is elevated as intellectual sophistication. Over time, individuals, particularly the youth, are encouraged to question not only authority, but also the legitimacy of their own cultural inheritance. History becomes something to critique rather than learn from, and identity becomes fragmented rather than rooted. The result is a population that feels adrift, uncertain of what is true, and increasingly disconnected from any shared moral or ethical compass. Once a society has been sufficiently demoralized, it enters the stage of destabilization. Here, the focus shifts from culture to structure. Political systems grow more polarized, economic systems more fragile, and trust in institutions begins to fracture. Law enforcement, the military, and intelligence agencies, which are traditionally pillars of national stability are subjected to scrutiny, criticism, and in some cases, deliberate weakening. Whether through internal dysfunction or external pressure, their ability to respond effectively to threats diminishes. At the same time, social tensions are amplified, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and division. Individuals no longer feel secure, and the sense of a stable, functioning society begins to erode. This instability sets the stage for crisis. In this phase, tensions reach a breaking point. Economic collapse, political upheaval, or widespread civil unrest can emerge rapidly, often catching the population off guard despite years of underlying pressure. Trust in institutions that is already weakened collapses entirely, and the public becomes desperate for order and direction. It is within this vacuum that radical solutions gain appeal. Ideas that would have once been rejected outright are now considered necessary or even inevitable. External factors or internal movements may step forward, offering clarity in the chaos, positioning themselves as the answer to a problem that has been carefully cultivated. In the final stage, normalization is where the transformation is cemented. The new ideology, once foreign or fringe, becomes institutionalized and accepted as the status quo. What was once questioned is now enforced. What was once defended is now forgotten. Cultural identity is reshaped, historical memory is reframed, and the population adapts to a new reality that feels, over time, entirely normal. The shift is rarely recognized as a completed process because it has been gradual, internalized, and reinforced at every level of society. To what extent are our beliefs genuinely our own? And to what extent have they been shaped by long-term cultural conditioning? When institutions shift direction, do we critically evaluate why, or do we adapt without resistance? Are we witnessing organic social change or patterns that suggest deliberate influence? Where have you seen ideological subversion? If the process of subversion depends on our participation, consciously or unconsciously, what responsibility do we bear in recognizing it, questioning it, and deciding whether to accept or resist the reality presented to us?
Let's go deeper now. Let's move beyond the surface outline and step fully into the psychological architecture of how society's mind can be quietly rewritten from the inside out. This isn't about labeling villains or pointing fingers outward. It's about tracing the invisible currents that move through every mind, every conversation, every quiet moment of doubt we've all felt at some point. Ideological subversion works because the human psyche is wired for coherence, for belonging, for a story that makes sense. When that rewiring is gently tugged, strand by strand, we don't feel the pull at first. We just notice the world feels a little off, a little heavier, until one day the entire frame has shifted and we're standing in a new landscape wondering how we got here. Consider the slow erosion of certainty itself. Psychologically, this stage preys on our most fundamental need for a stable sense of self and meaning. The mind abhors a vacuum, yet subversion creates one deliberately by introducing 1,000 tiny fractures in what we once took for granted. It doesn't scream that our foundations are wrong. It whispers questions that feel enlightened, compassionate, and sophisticated. Like, why cling to old certainties when everything is relative? Why defend traditions that seem rigid when fluidity feels freer? Over time, this isn't experienced as an attack. It registers as growth. But underneath, something profound is happening with the psyche. Cognitive dissonance sets in quietly. We begin to experience a low-grade, chronic discomfort with our own inheritance, a subtle shame attached to anything that once anchored us. Identity, once a rooted tree, becomes a collection of fragments. We're encouraged to remix endlessly. The result is a population not angry, not rebellious in the classic sense, but adrift. And drift is far more dangerous than rebellion because it leaves people exhausted, open, and hungry for anything that promises solidity again. This psychological drift doesn't stop at the individual level. It ripples outward into the collective perception. When enough people internalize this fragmentation, shared reality itself begins to dissolve. We stop trusting our own eyes and ears because we've been trained to view them as biased, limited, or unexamined. Instead, we outsource judgment to whatever narrative feels most current, most validated by the voices around us. The deeper implication here is chilling in its elegance. Subversion doesn't need to convince you of a new truth. It only needs to make you doubt the old one enough that you become passive in your own defense. You participate, not because you're coerced, but because questioning everything has been reframed as the highest virtue. The mind that once sought wisdom now seeks novelty. The heart that once sought belonging now seeks approval from the shifting consensus. And in that quiet exchange, agency is surrendered without a fight. What happens when the drift hardens into structural fracture? The psyche, already loosened from its moorings, becomes fertile ground for polarization, not as disagreement, but as an existential threat. Here, the psychological mechanisms shift from erosion to amplification. Human beings are tribal by nature. We form in-groups and out-groups instinctively for survival. Subversion doesn't create this instinct. It weaponizes it by flooding the environment with manufactured binaries. Every issue becomes important. Every disagreement becomes proof of moral failure. The result is a society where trust, that invisible glue holding all the institutions together, evaporates. Psychologically, this is devastating because we trust in the foundation of psychological safety. Without it, cortisol levels stay elevated. Chronic anxiety becomes the background music of daily life. People stop planning for the long term because the long term feels unreliable. They stop investing emotionally in community because community feels hostile or conditional. What's most fascinating and most insidious is how the stage turns our own virtues against us. Empathy, once a strength, becomes a lever. We're encouraged to extend it so broadly that it collapses into paralysis. Critical thinking, once a tool for clarity, mutates into endless deconstruction until nothing remains solid enough to stand on. The deeper meaning here is that destabilization isn't merely political or economic. It's an assault on the nervous system of an entire culture. When institutions that once provided order begin to wobble, the human brain, wired for pattern recognition, starts scanning frantically for new patterns, and that scanning creates vulnerability. We become hyper-attuned to threat, hypersensitive to narrative, and paradoxically less able to discern real danger from manufactured drama. The mind that was once resilient now lives in a state of low-level vigilance, exhausted yet primed for the next big rupture, or, unbeknownst to them, manufactured drama. This brings us to the moment of crisis, that psychological breaking point where accumulated pressure seeks release. Here, the mind's deepest survival circuits activate. In times of perceived chaos, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for nuanced reasoning, often hands the wheel over to the amygdala. Fight, fight, or freeze. And when an entire society reaches this state, simultaneously, something extraordinary and dangerous happens. The hunger for resolution overrides discernment. People who once valued complexity now crave simplicity. They who once defended process now demand results. This isn't weakness of character. It's neurology meeting environment. The brain, flooded with uncertainty, will latch onto any coherent story that promises restoration of order, even if that story requires rewriting yesterday's convictions. The implication is profound. Crisis doesn't just expose fractures, it creates the perfect psychological opening for ideas that would have been laughed off in calmer times. The mind, desperate for coherence, performs mental gymnastics to make a new narrative fit. Cognitive dissonance is resolved not by rejecting the new idea, but by retroactively adjusting the old ones until they align. What's happening at a neurological level is a form of learned helplessness on a cultural scale. When people have been conditioned through years of drift and fracture, they begin to believe that their own judgment is suspect, and they become remarkably receptive to external direction. The deeper exploration here reveals something almost compassionate about human nature. We are built to seek meaning, even in the ruins. But that very strength becomes the entry point. The crisis stage doesn't need to invent new desires. It only needs to channel existing ones. Fear of disorder and longing for purpose all go into a single funnel. Once the funnel is accepted, the psyche begins to work the rationalization of it, making the once unthinkable feel inevitable. Then comes the final psychological settlement, normalization. This is where the real alchemy occurs. What began as foreign, even shocking, slowly becomes the air we breathe. Psychologically, this is habitation at its most powerful. The brain is a prediction machine. Once a new pattern repeats long enough, it stops registering as new. It becomes the baseline. And the dissonance that once caused discomfort fades into background noise. Then silence, and then we adapt. But we forget we adapted. Cultural memory is reframed, not through force, but through repetition and social reinforcement. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are shift so gradually that we experience the changes as continually rather than a rupture. This is the stage where the subversion feels complete, because it no longer feels like subversion. It feels like maturity. It feels like progress. It feels like common sense. The deeper meaning of normalization is that it reveals the terrifying plasticity of human belief systems. We are not fixed entities. We are story-making machines, and when the stories change around us, we change with them. often without noticing the edit. The implication for the individual is both liberating and sobering. Our sense of self is far more malleable than we like to admit. This malleability is what allows growth, but also what allows quiet capture. On the societal level, normalization cements a new equilibrium where the transformed worldview enforces itself not through laws alone, but through the soft power of social approval and disapproval. Dissent becomes not illegal, but unthinkable, not because it's forbidden, but because it no longer computes within the new frame. Now, let's pull back and ask the uncomfortable questions that live at the heart of all this. To what extent are the beliefs we hold truly ours? How many of our convictions were seeded by years of subtle cultural conditioning rather than deliberate personal examination? When we find ourselves nodding along with shifts and institutional direction, are we engaging in critical evaluation or simply riding the current of least resistance? The psychological truth is that most of us participate unconsciously. We absorb the atmosphere, we mirror the consensus, we internalize the reframing because it's easier than constant resistance. But awareness changes everything. The moment we recognize the process while living inside it, we reclaim a measure of agency. We begin to notice the whispers. We begin to feel the tug, and in that noticing, the spell begins to weaken. The implications stretch far beyond any single generation. If ideological subversion succeeds, it doesn't just change policies, it changes the operating systems of a culture's mind. Future generations inherit not just new ideas, but a new way of processing reality itself. They inherit the normalized frame as default. Making it reverse is exponentially harder. Yet, the same psychological mechanisms that enable subversion also contain the seeds of renewal. Human beings retain an innate drive toward truth, toward coherence, and toward something authentic. That drive can be suppressed, redirected, or even weaponized, but it cannot be extinguished. The question becomes whether we can awaken before normalization completes its work. And I believe that we are the perfect example of this. Think for a moment about the personal level. How does this process affect your daily inner life? The quiet doubts that creep in during sleepless hours. The sense that something fundamental has shifted, but you can't quite name it. The way conversations with friends and family sometimes feel like they're happening across an invisible divide. These are not random anxieties. They are data points in a larger psychological transformation. Recognizing them as such is the first act of resistance. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, stubborn kind that refuses to outsource its own judgment. Broader still, consider what this means for the future of human freedom. If subversion operates through influence rather than force, then the battleground is internal. The mind itself becomes contested territory. Every book we read, every conversation we have, every piece of media we consume becomes either an act of reinforcement or an act of reclamation. The responsibility, then, is not to become paranoid, but to become discerning. Not to reject all change, but to interrogate its source and its trajectory. Not to cling blindly to the past, but to understand why certain foundations mattered in the first place. In the end, ideological subversion reveals something profoundly human: our extraordinary capacity for both self-deception and self-awakening. We are capable of sleepwalking into new realities, and we are equally capable of waking up inside them. The process depends on our participation. It also depends on our continued awareness. The moment enough of us begin to see patterns while living inside it, the long game begins to lose its power. And not because we became suddenly immune to influence, because we became conscious participants in the shaping of our own minds and reality. This is the deeper invitation tonight, not to fear the process, but to study it with clear eyes, and not to despair how far it may have advanced, but to recognize that awareness itself is a form of power. The transformation from within can be reversed from within, one examined belief at a time, one reclaimed conversation at a time, and one stubborn insistence on truth at a time. In the end, the light we're always coming back to isn't some external savior. It's the quiet persistence capacity within each of us to see clearly, to think independently, and to refuse to let our minds be rewritten without our conscious consent. To bring these psychological patterns into even sharper relief, let's turn to the pages of history and measurable data, where the 4 stages unfolded as lived reality and not abstract theory. Consider demoralization first. It sometimes takes decades for long softening of the collective mind. A striking medical example is the Soviet Union's abuse of psychiatry from the late 1950s through the 1970s. Political dissent was labeled sluggish, schizophrenia, a fabricated condition. Dissidents faced commitment to hospitals and insulin shock therapy. Amnesty International estimated at least 20,000 people were institutionalized this way by the 1970s. This shows how medicine itself became an enforcer of ideology. Questioning the system was no longer moral or political. It was diagnosed as insanity. The mind learned to police itself, fracturing internal trust in one's own moral compass. Western data also echoes this slow erosion. Gallup's long-term tracking shows confidence in major U.S. institutions failing from an average around 48% in 1979, expressing a great deal or quite a lot of confidence, to near record lows of 26 to 28% in recent years. This map to the 15 to 20-year generational window Bezmenov described is the time needed to educate and cohort into relativism, fragment identity, and replace a shared foundation with perpetual critique. When trust erodes gradually, people adapt by lowering expectations rather than revolting. Destabilization follows, and structures fracture and social anxiety spikes. The Weimar Republic offers a clear case. After World War I defeat and the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, the 1920s brought cultural relativism and economic strain. Hyperinflation peaked in 1923. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in 1922 soared to 200 billion marks by November 1923. Political polarization turned into street violence. Institutions were portrayed as corrupt, and trust collapsed. Citizens, already adrift, grew hypervigilant, scanning for saviors. This acute phase lasted roughly 5 years before tipping into crisis. Crisis arrived suddenly after accumulated pressure. In Weirmere, it crystallized in 1932 to 1933. It deepened economic collapse from the Great Depression. People were desperate to find a radical solution. By January 1933, the new regime consolidated power. The unthinkable became inevitable. This exhausted ambiguity. The mind embraced simplistic certainty that promised order. Normalization then cements the shift so completely that the old world feels like a distant dream. In the Soviet case, by the 1980s, psychiatric abuse was defended in journals as progressive science. In post-1933 Germany, the new ideology was taught in schools and enforced through social pressure until it simply felt normal. Citizens reframed history and forgot what had been lost. The same pattern appeared in the Soviet bloc after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. These examples show how subversion succeeds through participation. The data revealed the slow bleed of trust. Medical cases illustrate co-opted healing professionals and historical outbreaks. Weirmere's 1920s to 1930s chaos demonstrate how stages compound until populations demand the final transformation. No tanks or bombs were required, only the steady tug on humanity's need for belonging, meaning, and certainty. Yet, history also holds counterforces. Awareness interrupts the pattern. The Soviet psychiatric machine faced exposure in the 1970s through internal pressure and defectors. Weimar's lessons echo for any generation that studies rather than repeats them. Let's look how this process reshapes the most intimate corners of life. The once unquestioned pillars of daily stability and personal meaning. Consider when openly loving one's country as a patriot becomes viewed with suspicion or disdain. Right after the September 11th attacks, Gallup recorded 87% of Americans describing themselves as extremely or very proud to be American. Flags flew everywhere. Civic rituals felt unifying, but by June 2025, Gallup figured that had fallen to a record low of 58% extremely very proud, with the extremely proud category at 41% near historic lows. Among younger adults, 18 to 34, it often sits far lower, and Democrats have reached particularly low ratings around 34%. Until 2018, fewer than 10% consistently reported little or no national pride. Now that segment approaches 20%. Patriotism, once the shared emotional grammar of belonging, now carries social risk in many conversations, classrooms, and online spaces. The psyche registers the shift. Attachment to one's homeland, gratitude for its institutions, and defense of its principles begin to feel embarrassing rather than ennobling. This severs the emotional tether to a shared story, leaving people more isolated and open to new narratives of allegiance. The same inversion has touched the longing for a stable family, a committed marriage, rooted household, and children raised within that shelter. In 1960s, about 72% of American adults were married, and roughly 44% of households included married parents with children under 18. The share of children living with two married biological parents stood near 87%. Today, the percentage of married adults has dropped to around 46 to 47%. Married couple households hover at a near 47%, and the portion of households with married parents and children has fallen sharply. Projections suggest that 1 in 3 young adults may never marry. These changes arrived not through sudden catastrophe, but through decades of reframing. Stable family structure portrayed as restrictive or outdated. Delayed marriage or fluid arrangements were elevated as liberated, and lifelong commitment quietly downgraded to one option among many. What was once the unmarked norm, wanting a spouse, children, and a home centered on that bond, now sometimes registers as quaint or even suspect. Yet, we are wired for attachment. Stable two-parent homes consistently correlate with better emotional, academic, and relational outcomes for children. When that desire is subtly looked down upon, people internalize conflict, yearning privately while hedging publicly to avoid friction. Chronic loneliness and declining interpersonal trust, falling from around 46% in the early 1970s to about 34% in recent measurements, echo the resulting vacuum. Patriotism and stable family formation sit at the heart of how subversion operates through us. They anchor the human needs for continuity, loyalty, and intergenerational transmission. In demoralization, these attachments recast as problems to deconstruct. In destabilization, fragmentation amplifies anxiety. Crisis offers radical alternatives to fill the void. Normalization makes the new, more atomized reality feel inevitable. These shifts accelerated noticeably from the late 1960s onward, compounding over generations exactly as the model forecasts. The deeper psychological truth is that humans thrive when tethered to places, to people, to principles worth defending. When those tethers are gently loosened and reframed as chains, the mind adapts, often with a mix of relief at the freedom and a lingering ache. Recognizing this while living inside it restores agency. It allows us to reclaim the legitimacy of open patriotism without apology and quiet dignity of pursuing a stable family without shame. These desires formed the unspoken consensus that gave mid-20th century societies resilience. Their gradual demotion is not mere organic evolution, but a symptom of the longer process. This awareness doesn't reject all change. It demands discernment. Which shifts strengthen our capacity for meaning, and which quietly hollow it out. History and data remind us that societies can drift far before the costs surface in collapsing trust, delayed milestones, and fractured belonging. Yet countercurrents exist, persistent pockets of national pride and growing conversations about the personal and societal price of the rootlessness. The process demands an unconscious participation, but consciousness itself begins the reversal. The quiet, deliberate act of stepping back from the current and asking the questions that changes everything. What am I actually seeing, feeling, and participating in right now? Reflection is not passive observation. It is a psychological counterweight in the entire process of subversion. The moment the mind stops absorbing the atmosphere and starts interrogating it. In real life, this shows up as a sudden pause in the middle of a conversation when something feels slightly off. the microsecond of an internal hesitation before we nod along or change the subject. It is the late-night scroll through the news or social feeds that leave a vague uneasiness in the chest. Not rage, not clarity, just the quiet sense that the story being told does not quite line up with what we are living. These are not dramatic revelations. They are the subtle internal human responses that subversion tries to drown out. The faint cognitive dissonance, the flicker of self-doubt, the unspoken ache that says, "This doesn't feel like me." Look around your own days. Notice how often a casual exchange about current events ends with someone saying, "Well, that's just how things are now." A verbal shrug that signals the normalization phase has already taken root in everyday speech. Watch the behavioral patterns, the way people increasingly self-censor in mixed company, choosing silence over the risk of being labeled outdated or extreme. Internally, the response is low-level adaptation, a quiet rewriting of personal boundaries so that what once felt like common sense now feels controversial, even to voice. The human mind, wired for social harmony, begins to perform small daily compromises, laughing at a joke that feels wrong, scrolling past a headline that triggers quiet alarms, or nodding through a classroom or workplace discussion that reframes yesterday's virtues as today's voices. These are not conscious betrayals. They are survival reflexes inside a culture that has made independent reflection socially expensive. Reflection turns these reflexes visible. It asks us to track the internal scoreboard. How many times this week did I feel a tug of discomfort, yet push it aside? How many family dinners have shifted from shared stories to careful topic avoidance? How many moments of genuine national pride or simple gratitude for a stable home life now come wrapped in private hesitation? Should I even say this out loud? The psychological reality is that subversion thrives in unexamined stream of everyday life. When we stop and reflect, we interrupt the current. The internal human response shifts from passive drift to active agency. Suddenly, the fragmented identity begins to feel less like sophistication and more like loss. The chronic low-grade anxiety of destabilization reveals itself not as inevitable modern stress, but as the predictable outcome of severed roots. The hunger in crisis moments stop feeling like depression for any answer and starts looking like a cultivated vulnerability. In real life, this reflective practice shows up in small, repeated behaviors that rebuild personal sovereignty. It is choosing to journal the quiet doubts instead of dismissing them. It is pausing before consuming the next piece of media and asking, whose frame am I stepping into right now? It is the deliberate conversation with a friend or a partner where you name the pattern aloud, not to argue, but to witness it together. The internal response is immediate and visceral. A slight straightening of the spine, a deeper breath, a return to emotional clarity. Over time, these micro moments compound. We no longer allow behavioral patterns that once reinforced the drift, like outsourcing judgment, mirroring the consensus, adapting without questioning. And when we do this, it begins to reverse. People report a strange but profound sense of coming home to themselves. The mind that was trained to seek novelty rediscovers the steady comfort of continuity. The heart that learned to hedge its deepest longings reclaims the right to want what it naturally wants: belonging, loyalty, and a stable place to stand. When enough individuals engage in this honest internal audit, the collective atmosphere itself begins to shift. The process that depends on unconscious participation loses its grip the moment consciousness becomes habitual. We stop sleepwalking through the stages and start walking with eyes open. The real-life evidence is already visible in quiet pockets of resistance. Families choosing to prioritize rooted traditions despite the cultural headwinds. Individuals speaking plainly about love of country without apology. Communities rebuilding trust through face-to-face reflection rather than digital consensus. This is the bridge back to self that subversion tries to erase. It restores the operating system of our own minds by reminding us that we are not merely products of the cultural weather, we are the ones who can choose to change the forecast. In the quiet act of noticing, questioning, and refusing to let the pattern run on autopilot, we reclaim the very agency the 4 stages were designed to dissolve. And it begins the moment we pause and ask ourselves, right here, right now, can you see the pattern? So, as we bring this exploration to a close, remember that every stage we have walked through, the slow erosion of certainty, the fracture of structures, the desperate hunger of crisis, and the quiet settling of normalization, ultimately circles back to this single personal capacity, the willingness to reflect and to see the pattern while we're still living inside it. The mind begins to breathe again. Behavior patterns that once reinforced fragmentation start to realign toward coherence. The heart remembers its deeper loyalties. We are not powerless passengers on this long journey of ideological transformation. We are the ground on which it either takes root or withers. The light we seek has always been waiting within the simple act of seeing clearly and refusing to let our inner compass be rewritten without consent. So I leave you with this. If you truly recognize the pattern unfolding in your own life right now, in the quiet hesitations, the shifted conversations, things you once held dear and now treated as suspect, what small deliberate step would you take today to begin to reclaim the ground of your own mind and sovereignty?
I'd love to hear where you land on this. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Or continue the conversation in our Telegram group. We'll see you again next week, and if you found this of value, be sure to share it out. Let's spread the awareness.
Thank you all so much for being here. A huge thanks to our mod Claudia, producer Carrie, and songwriter Todd. And to you, our listeners. Thank you for opening your mind. Remember, every story we believe shapes our reality. Stay curious and don't be afraid to question the narrative.
Only after the truth has come about, it walks into the room with lights thrown throughout. Can the minds of the sleeping and the lying about awake from their slumber to stumble on out of the mind control that has placed them inside rooms of deception the human brain provides. No place for logic in these darkened rooms. Common sense lost within the vacuum of construes, leaving no hope for rescue in this lying state. Rooms piling high with just more of the same. Unless, of course, the light of truth, like the break of day, finds its way through the keyhole of night, unlocking the way, opening the door for the dawning to be saved. That's what we do in this awakening. which unlocks the minds of our brothers and sisters, one room at a time. Room service for the mind, one room at a time. Room service for the mind.